If you thought the worst was over, Amina's nightmare has only just begun. The man she loved is not dead. He is bound to something ancient. And now, whatever brought him back, wants her unborn child. Welcome to part 2 of this haunting African folk tale. The next morning, Amina decided to return to the hidden room in Jabari's mansion. She needed to understand what the rituals involved. But as she flipped through the pages, she noticed something she hadn't before. One of the rituals had been crossed out with a note scribbled in the margin. It said, "Do not attempt. The consequences are irreversible." Amina got more curious to find out more. She read the ritual carefully, and her blood ran cold. It was a summoning ritual, meant to call forth a powerful entity from another world. But something had gone wrong. The notes described how the entity had taken control, binding itself to the person calling it. Amina realized with horror that this was what had happened to Jabari. He had tried to cheat death, but instead, he had become a vessel for something far worse. And now that entity was after her and her baby. Amina knew that she had to leave. She couldn't stay with Jabari, not after what she had learned. But leaving wouldn't be easy. Jabari had eyes everywhere, and the entity seemed to be watching her every move. She packed a small bag with essentials and waited until nightfall. As she crept out of her hut, she heard a voice behind her. "And where do you think you're going?" Amina turned around and saw Jabari standing there, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She froze, her heart pounding. But before she could respond, Coffee appeared out of nowhere, grabbing her arm and pulling her away. "Run!" he shouted. Amina and Coffee ran through the village, their footsteps echoing in the silent night. Behind them, they could hear Jabari's voice, calling out to Amina. "You can't escape me," he shouted. "You are mine." Amina's legs burned as she ran, but she did not stop. She couldn't. Coffee led her to a small hidden path that wound through the forest. "This way," he said with urgency, pulling her along. As they ran, Amina noticed something strange. The trees around them seemed to twist and bend, as if they were alive. The air grew colder, and the whispers from her dream returned, growing louder with every step. Coffee led Amina to a small hidden cabin deep within the forest. "We will be safe here," he said, locking the door behind them. "But we can't stay long. He will find us eventually." Amina collapsed onto the floor, her chest heaving. "What is he?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Coffee hesitated, then sighed. "He's not human," he said. "That entity, it's using him to feed. And now that you're pregnant, it wants your child." Amina's heart sank. She had been so focused on escaping Jabari that she hadn't considered the danger to her unborn child. "What do we do?" she asked. Coffee looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. "We fight," he said, "but it won't be easy. That entity is powerful, and it won't let go without a fight." Amina and Coffee spent the next few days preparing for the battle ahead. Coffee taught her how to use the symbols and rituals from the Book of Magic, while Amina focused on protecting her child. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, and the shadows around the cabin seemed to close in. One night, as Amina was sleeping, she heard a knock on the door. She opened her eyes and saw Jabari standing there, his eyes glowing in a scary way. "You can't run forever," he said, his voice cold and menacing. Amina knew this was it, the final stand. She grabbed the Book of Magic and stepped outside, ready to face whatever came next. The air was thick with tension as Amina stepped out of the cabin, the book of magic clutched tightly in her hands. Jabari stood a few feet away, his silhouette illuminated by the pale moonlight. His eyes glowed with an eerie red light. His voice was cold and hollow. "You can't run from me, Amina," he said, his words echoing unnaturally. "You belong to me." Amina's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. "I don't belong to anyone," she replied, her voice shaking but defiant. Behind her, Coffee emerged from the cabin, holding a small vial filled with a shimmering liquid. "Stay back, Jabari," Coffee warned. "This doesn't have to end badly." Jabari laughed, a sound that sent chills down Amina's spine. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing but a pawn in this game." He took a step forward, and the ground beneath him seemed to darken, as if the shadows were alive and feeding off his presence. Amina glanced at Coffee, who nodded silently. They had practiced for this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure if they were ready. Coffee threw the vial at Jabari's feet, and it shattered, releasing a cloud of silver smoke. Jabari staggered back, his glowing eyes flickering. "What is this?" he snarled, his voice distorted. With her eyes full of fear, Amina took the opportunity to open the book of magic and began reciting one of the rituals they had prepared. The symbols on the pages glowed faintly, and the air around them crackled with energy. But before she could finish, Jabari lunged at her, his hand outstretched. Amina screamed as his cold fingers brushed her arm, sending a wave of numbness through her body. Coffee tackled Jabari to the ground, giving Amina a chance to complete the ritual. She shouted the final words, and a blinding light erupted from the book of magic, engulfing everything in its path. When the light faded, Jabari was gone. The forest was silent, and the shadows had retreated. Amina collapsed to her knees, exhausted but relieved. Coffee helped her to her feet, but his face was grim. "It's not over," he said. "That was just a temporary solution. The entity is still out there, and it won't stop until it has what it wants." The days that followed were a blur for Amina. She returned to the village with Coffee, but nothing felt the same. The villagers whispered as she passed, their eyes filled with fear and suspicion. Amina knew they could sense that something was wrong, but she didn't have the energy to explain. Her thoughts were consumed by the baby growing inside her. What would happen to her child? Would it inherit Jabari's curse, or would it be free from the entity's influence? She couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was still watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Coffee stayed by her side, helping her prepare for the next phase of their plan. "We need to find the source of the entity's power," he explained one evening as they sat by the fire. "If we can destroy it, we might be able to break the bond between Jabari and the entity." Amina nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her chest. "What if we are too late?" she asked. "What if the entity already has a hold on my child?" Coffee didn't answer, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know, that they were running out of time. Coffee led Amina deep into the forest, to a place she had never been before. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisting together to form a natural canopy that blocked out the sun. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sound was the distant cry of a bird. After hours of walking, they reached a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone temple, its walls covered in moss and vines. The entrance was a narrow archway, carved with symbols that matched those in the Book of Magic. Amina's heart raced as she approached the temple, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach. "This is where it all began," Kofi said, his voice low. "The entity was summoned here centuries ago, and its power is tied to this place. If we destroy the temple, we might be able to weaken it." Amina nodded, but as they stepped inside, she felt a sudden wave of nausea. The air was thick with a strange energy, and the walls seemed to pulse with a faint rhythmic glow. She held onto the book tightly. Kofi led her to a large chamber in the center of the temple. In the middle of the room was a stone altar, covered in strange markings. Above the altar hung a black crystal, suspended in mid-air and glowing unnaturally. "That is where the ritual happened," Kofi said, pointing to the crystal. "We need to destroy it." But before they could move, a voice echoed through the chamber. "You are late." Amina turned and saw Jabari standing in the doorway, his eyes glowing brighter than she had ever seen them. Behind him, the shadows seemed to twist, forming shapes that looked almost human. Jabari stepped into the chamber, his movements slow and deliberate. The shadows followed him, swirling around his feet like a living thing. Amina's heart raced as she backed away, clutching the book to her chest. Kofi stood protectively in front of her, his eyes locked on Jabari. "You can't win," Jabari said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "The entity is too powerful, but it is willing to make a deal." Amina's breath caught in her throat. "What kind of deal?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jabari smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was a cold and calculating smile. "The entity wants your child," he said, "but it's willing to spare your life in exchange. All you have to do is to give it what it wants." Amina's stomach churned. She looked down at her belly, where her child was growing. How could she make such a choice? How could she sacrifice her baby to save herself? Kofi stepped forward, his voice firm. "We are not making any deals with you," he said. "We are here to destroy the entity, not bargain with it." Jabari's smile faded, and his eyes narrowed. "Then you leave me no choice," he said. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around Kofi and pulling him to the ground. Amina screamed as she watched him struggle, but there was nothing she could do. Jabari turned to her, his glowing eyes filled with a cold light. "It's time to end this," he said. Amina's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. She couldn't let Jabari win, but she also couldn't let the entity take her child. She glanced at the book in her hands, and an idea began to form. She opened the book to a page she had studied earlier, one that described a ritual to banish an entity back to its kingdom. It was dangerous and required a sacrifice, but it might be their only chance. As Jabari advanced towards her, Amina began reciting the words from the book. The symbols on the pages began to glow brighter, and the air around her crackled with energy. Jabari hesitated, his glowing eyes flickering with uncertainty. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice filled with anger. Amina didn't answer. She focused on the ritual, pouring all her energy into the words. The ground beneath her began to shake, and the black crystal above the altar started to crack. Jabari lunged at her, but it was too late. The ritual was complete. A blinding light filled the chamber, and the shadows screamed as they were pulled into the crystal. Jabari's body began to dissolve, his form breaking apart into tiny fragments of light. As the light faded, Amina collapsed to the ground, exhausted but alive. The temple was silent, and the shadows were gone. Kofi stirred beside her, his face pale but unharmed. "Did it work?" he asked, his voice weak. Amina nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she said. But as she looked down at her belly, she couldn't shake the feeling that the entity's influence wasn't completely gone. The temple stood in eerie silence, the air heavy with the remains of the ritual's energy. Amina lay on the cold stone floor, her body trembling from exhaustion. The book rested beside her. Its pages were dull and lifeless, as if the magic had been drained from them completely. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Coffee stirred nearby. His movements were slow and deliberate, as he pushed himself up from the ground. His face was pale, and his eyes scanned the chamber for any sign of danger. The shadows were gone. The black crystal had shattered into countless shards that littered the altar. The entity's presence had vanished, but the weight of its evil lingered in the air like a bad memory. Amina's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where her child rested. She could feel the faint flutter of life, a reminder of the risks that had driven her to this point. The entity was gone, but the fear remained. Had it truly been defeated, or was this only a temporary postponement of what was to come? The question worried her, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of relief. The journey back to the village was a somber one. The forest seemed quieter than usual, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Amina walked beside Coffee, her steps slow and unsteady. Her body ached, and her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: relief, fear, and an overwhelming sense of unease. The villagers watched them as they approached. Their eyes were curious and suspicious. Amina could feel their gazes on her, but she kept her head down, unwilling to meet their stares. She knew that they could sense that something was wrong, that the darkness she had faced had left its mark on her. Coffee helped her to her hut, where she collapsed onto her bed, too exhausted to think or feel. Sleep came quickly, but it was far from restful. Her dreams were filled with shadows and whispers, and Jabari's face haunted her, his glowing eyes staring into her soul. Days turned into weeks, and life in the village returned to its usual rhythm. Amina tried to move on, focusing on the life growing inside her, and the hope that the entity was truly gone. But strange things began to happen. Objects in her hut would move on their own, as if pushed by an invisible hand. The air would grow cold, even though the weather was hot, and she would feel a presence watching her, even when she was alone. At night, the whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, calling her name in a voice that sent chills down her spine. Coffee noticed the change in her. He would often find her staring into the distance, her eyes filled with fear. He tried to reassure her, but even he couldn't ignore the signs. The entity was gone, but its influence remained. There was a lingering shadow that refused to fade. One night, Amina found herself drawn to the Book of Secrets. It sat on the table, its pages still and silent, but she could feel a faint pulse of energy coming from it. She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. Near the end of the book, she found a section she had never seen before. The symbols were different, more intricate, and the pages seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. As she studied them, she realized that they described a ritual, one that could permanently sever the connection between the entity and its vessel. But there was a catch. The ritual required a sacrifice, not of life, but of memory. The person performing it would lose a part of themselves, a piece of their past that could never be recovered. Amina's heart sank as she read the words. Was she willing to pay such a price? Could she bear to lose a part of who she was to ensure her child's safety? Amina spent the next few days in quiet contemplation. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. She thought about her life, her struggles, and the few precious memories she had. Losing any part of them felt like losing a piece of her soul. But then she thought of her child, the innocent life growing inside her. She couldn't let the entity's influence affect her child. She couldn't let her child grow up in a world tainted by darkness. The choice was clear, but that didn't make it any easier. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amina made her decision. She gathered the materials for the ritual, her hands steady despite the fear in her heart. Coffee stood by her side, his presence a silent reassurance. He didn't need to speak for her to know that he supported her. Amina had seen the truth, but the curse wasn't done with her yet. Part 3 is coming. Don't miss the next chapter of this African folktale.